At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Do you want to give them a quote, Minister?
Well, why not? Say, it was a tough decision, but a necessary one. Britain is to retain the name of,
The Compassionate Society, Minister?
Thank you, Humphrey. The Compassionate Society. You got that, Bernard?
Oh, yes, Minister.
Welcome to Quiet Right, the podcast that boosts the illumination while taking out the heat, the politics podcast equivalent of LED. I'm Alex Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith, here to help you navigate the treacherous conditions of modern political life.
And I'm producer Kenny, keeping the good ship quite right in calm seas and away from rocks, all while squinting at my nav charts upside down.
Our aim is to help you get up to speed.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
With what really matters, ignore what doesn't, and give you ways to take action.
So set your UKT alarm, pop on the kettle, grab your favourite mug from the cupboard, and help us to begin another Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Right. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi. We have been incredibly touched by the reaction to our Sunday school show, which focused heavily on how to fight proposed welfare cuts. Your messages of thanks and support help spur us on in these difficult times and makes it feel as though all the hard work and late nights are worth it. So thank you to everyone who has reached out.
Plus, thank you to everyone who has listened to our brand new offering, Andreou's PODYSSEY. We've smashed into the top 10 charts across all podcast categories, and the feedback has been overwhelming. So a personal thank you for that one.
On today's show, we're going to be discussing the statement from Liz Kendall about welfare cuts, the reaction from the Parliamentary Labour Party, from opposition and from voters, plus, with less than 2 months to go until the big summit between Starmer and von der Leyen on the reset, we delve into where things are at with pro-European conservatism in British politics.
Plus, we're going to talk about the justice system and the state of UK prisons.
So who better to help us unpick all of that and more than former Treasury Secretary, former Work and Pension Secretary and former Justice Secretary, who now leads an expert panel carrying out an independent review of sentencing, the Right Honourable David Gauke. Welcome, David.
Hello, very good to be with you.
David, like me, you're a football fan.
Yes.
Spurs for me, Ipswich Town for you. Let's face it, neither of us having a stellar season. But is there something about congregating with other people, singing songs and commiserating? It's just quite good for the soul, especially actually when your team is doing badly.
Well, I was present when Ipswich had their heaviest defeat of modern times when we lost 9-0 at Old Trafford against Manchester United. And I have to say, by the end of the afternoon, the mood was actually quite jolly.
Aww.
Yeah, once to be fair, we were a bit angry. I think the 7th goal should have been disallowed. but yes, there was Andy Cole scored 5 against us. And he'd relatively recently signed for Manchester United, and the sort of charm, what a waste of money. There is there's some consolation to be found in that. And I don't get to as many games as I would like to, but even just listening to Ipswich Town podcasts and stuff like that, done by fans, you can there's fellow feeling there. Better to share the pain than suffer alone.
Yeah, I have to say I'd been going to Spurs games, and when I ended up actually buying a season ticket was right after losing 7-1 to Chelsea.
Were they going cheap?
Hat-trick to Torre, Andre Flo and Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, to give you an idea of the
going
era
back a little bit.
we're talking about. But there is actually something to being trounced that knits you with your fellow fans in a strange way.
When I first met my partner, we were doing the usual getting to know each other kind of questions. And I asked him, when did you last cry? Because I thought that, I was young and I thought, well, I need to know if this man is emotionally intelligent in any way, shape or form. And he is from Exeter and he is a big Exeter City fan. And he thought about it and he thought about it. And then he turned to me and he said, when Exeter drew with Man United at Old Trafford and we got half the gate.
I like that, both emotionally intelligent and mercenary.
I feel that pain being Scottish. It's not as if I'm a stranger to sporting disappointments. Let's put it like that. But it does mean that when the happy moments come, they are particularly happy. And I remember years ago at one of my first Old Firm games, which are always a particularly big deal. We turned up late. We only just got into the game, and by the time we sat down, I'm a blue nose. I'm a Rangers fan. Sorry, Celtic fans out there. We were already 1-0 down. So I travelled all the way from the Highlands to go and watch this game at great personal expense and borrowed my father's car, borrowed in inverted commas, and we were already 1-0 down. And that day, we won 5-1. So Ali McCoy scored and the goals just kept coming all of a sudden from the depths of despair.
You were the good luck charm.
Well, it was such a strange day because that day, when the fourth goal went in, is the first time that I've ever kissed a strange man. An unshaved Glaswegian, and he grabbed me.
Not the last.
Joined the queue, big boy.
Quiet, riot.
Now, on Tuesday, Liz Kendall unveiled the much anticipated and in some quarters much feared Green Paper on welfare benefits reform. It contains a long list of measures, all of which we could not possibly hope to cover, and many of which we actually don't have enough detail on. Overall, I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies description captures it most laconically. At its core, they write, the decision is to tilt the welfare system away from those who are disabled and towards those who are unemployed without an assessed disability. The Resolution Foundation has summed up the more worrying aspects of the package as follows. The irony of this health and disability green paper is that the main beneficiaries are those without health problems or a disability. And while it includes some sensible reforms which should encourage more people into work, too many of the proposals have been driven by the need for short-term savings rather than long-term reform. The result risks being a major income shock for millions. Meanwhile, Helen Whately, the first shadow work and pension secretary to be an actual shadow, said the announcements were too little, too late. Quite an extraordinary thing to say after 14 years in power and 8 months out of power. The reforms were also criticised for not going far enough by the geniuses behind Trussonomics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Centre for Social Studies, and the Adam Smith Institute, which is basically just one guy leaving the room and coming back with a Groucho Marx disguise. The more cogent criticism has come from Labour's own backbenches, eloquently expressed by the chair of the Work and Pension Select Committee, Debbie Abrahams.
I absolutely agree. Our social security system isn't fit for purpose. And I think the measures, particularly in terms of increasing employment support by $1 billion a year, by increasing the standard allowance of universal credit, something unfortunately the opposition failed to do when they were in government, will be really, really positively felt. I also appreciate the difficult financial circumstances we face ourselves, and in spite of the $5 billion being said by the party opposite to be a huge figure, it's actually the largest cut in social security support since 2015. And I would put that there are alternative, more compassionate ways to balance the books rather than on the back of sick and disabled people. I absolutely fundamentally believe that my right honourable friend is on the right course, and I implore my party to try and get our reforms to bed in first before we look to making the cuts, a point that others have also made. There's so much evidence of the adverse effects that the party opposite had with the cuts in support and the restrictions in eligibility criteria when they were in government, including the deaths of vulnerable people. And we can't have a repeat of that.
But on the whole, no large rebellion, no ministerial resignations, no super aggressive questions at Wednesday's PMQs. Starmer and Kendall, I think, will be pleased, although the issue could re-emerge when impact assessments and details are published next week with a spring statement. So, Liz Kendall's speech, what are our first impressions? Shall we start with you, David?
I might not be going with the rest of us here, but I have quite a lot of sympathy with the situation the government finds itself in. First of all, in terms of the big picture of the fiscal situation, they're in very strong danger of not meeting their fiscal rules. I think it's hard for them to cut public spending in departments, and I think it's difficult for them to raise taxes, having done so very significantly in October, and also having ruled out most of the major taxes in the general election. So there's that point. Then we do have this issue that the cost of disability benefits are rising very, very substantially. More and more people are claiming them. We are an outlier on this in terms of what is happening post-pandemic. There is a lot, I think, in the argument that the government is making is that if you can get people into work, that is better for them than not being in work. This is a really tricky area, and the fact is that the money you save, you are directly taking off people. Of course, what you hope is that you will have a positive behavioural change. As you sort of reduce access to some benefits, does that provoke a behavioural response of more likely to get into work, et cetera, et cetera? And that's clearly what the government is aiming to do. I think you're right to say we need to really see the details as to, and then see the evidence as to how successful that is going to be. But I can, there is a challenge for us as a country to ensure that our welfare system is sustainable and helps people, doesn't trap people. And I think the government does have to address that.
I mean, you are one of actually the notable exceptions who has defended austerity after the event, after it sort of ceased to be fashionable, I guess, politically to defend austerity. And you have made some cogent arguments, but my question is, can austerity come in successive waves? Because that is, I think, when you get into trouble, how much fat can you trim from the system before you begin to cut into muscle and bone? Like, one of the things you have acknowledged is that part of Labour's difficult inheritance is the fact that they've inherited public services that are threadbare. So that is kind of a result of already a couple of rounds of austerity. How much can you keep adding to that?
I think it depends in a way how we're defining austerity. I mean, fundamentally, I would make the argument you always have to have sustainable public finances. And you have to do what it takes to get those public finances sustainable. But I do agree with the point that you're making that when it comes to certain public services, can you just keep going back and reducing and reducing and reducing? And the answer is no, that eventually it gets to a point where they fall below an acceptable level. And at that point, or before you get to that point, actually you have to ask some more fundamental, well, you've got two choices. One, either you tax more, so you fund it, but that's still delivering fiscal sustainability. Or two, you identify those areas of what the state does that it could do less of and take that on. But that is really hard to do as well. And one of the criticisms I very often make to other Conservatives is when they say, well, we've got to cut down on spending. Well, where exactly? It's all very well saying, in broad terms, we believe that you've got to cut spending. You do have to be quite specific. And it is harder for this government to cut spending on public services than it was for us in 2010, because in 2010 we came in after a period of roughly 9 years or so where public spending had risen pretty dramatically, had run ahead of inflation, that public sector pay had done much better than private sector pay during the global financial crisis. So it meant that public sector pay was very competitive, and one of the easiest ways in which you could control public spending was to rebalance that. I mean, that's a euphemism. I mean, essentially, it was to be very tight on public sector pay, but that was only taking people back to the position that we'd been in a few years previously. That isn't the situation that we're in today. And I was making this point before the last election, is that I thought Labour would have to come in and put taxes up because private sector pay had done better than public sector pay. So, it was a struggle to attract staff.
Can I ask you about one of those taxes, national insurance contributions for employers?
Yeah.
Which was also being debated in Parliament this week, because the amendments have come back from the House of Lords on that into the Commons. We've talked about it on the show previously, but how difficult is it for the government to deliver on what it hopes the welfare cuts will do? The very kinds of young people in particular, but those who might be lower skilled or have had quite a long time out of the jobs market, the kinds of jobs they might be able to go for are surely now going to be in slightly shorter supply, because it's those kinds of roles that are going to be most negatively impacted. So is doing both of these things at once setting themselves up for a lose-lose situation?
Yeah, I think there is an interesting tension here. We have, if you go back pre-pandemic days, before we've seen this big increase of people on out-of-work benefits, we had a very, very high level of a very high employment rate, very low unemployment rate. And there are criticisms you can make of the model we had, the employment market that we had.
Underemployment.
Underemployment and so on. And, were people able to progress and so on. But we did have a system that meant that there were jobs. We created a lot of jobs for a long time. This isn't to do with one political party or one government, but we have created lots of jobs. It's been a labour market where people could get into employment if they wanted to, and were capable of working. And I do wonder, with the change in national insurance contributions, and it's not so much the increase in the rate to 15%, but the starting the threshold much earlier at the lower level. I almost wonder whether there is something quite deliberate here, which is, we don't like that model that is very flexible, that it's possible to have lots of low-paid part-time jobs there that might be quite low on productivity, and better to move in the direction of more continental European model, the French model, where actually you have higher unemployment, but the jobs that you have produce higher productivity rates and potentially greater levels of progression. I've not heard a Labour minister ever explicitly say that, in public or in private, but I do wonder if that's a little bit of the thinking there.
But it's surely incongruous with then the aim to get these people on long-term benefits back to work.
It does raise attention. There's also points to with the national minimum wage and what have you. Yes, if you do that, one of the costs is you have fewer of those entry-level jobs, in whether that's in retail or hospitality and so on, where lots of people can kind of find employment and then build up from there. And I think you're right, Naomi. I think that is there is a tension.
Quiet Riot. This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Quiet Riot. And you've talked as well about the rules Labour has set itself, and we can call them that, or we can call it their manifesto commitments. And it feels to me like they're boxing themselves into a corner when you combine the commitment to no more tax rises, not changing the fiscal rules, and not pursuing growth through improving the trade deal with Europe.
But we thought that at the time of the manifesto,
and we
right?
did. We did. I mean,
we said that. And this is the bit I really don't understand. The situation with the Trump White House and Ukraine and the increased need for defense spending has created perfect political cover for Labour to get out of that cul-de-sac they put themselves into, and they just haven't taken it.
I think there was an opportunity for them. I think particularly the defence spending point. I don't think we should underestimate how uncomfortable it would be, and politically I think they would take a hit. But if you look at all of their choices, if they take a real knife to departmental public spending at the spending review, that is going to play out as well. I don't think there are any good choices there. I'm not an enthusiast for higher taxes, but I do wonder whether the best choice for a Labour government to have taken would have been to lean into this and say, sorry, we actually are going to have to world. And because if you want to raise serious sums of money, you do have to raise the broad-based taxes. Two-thirds of all the government's revenue comes in from it's income tax, VAT, and national insurance contributions. I mean, I think they were pushing it a bit to argue that employers' NICs was outside the promise they made to the British public, but I think they've probably got away with that. But you can't keep coming back to that, and it's hard to see where else they're going to raise substantial sums of revenue.
Interesting. Can I ask you about there's something that came up in PMQs today that flew under the radar? Back in October, Reeves said that by the end of this parliamentary term, income tax thresholds would be keeping pace with inflation again. And I don't think they've done that since 2019. And certainly since the beginning of this century, fiscal drag has been an issue. For listeners, fiscal drag is when your tax allowance basically doesn't keep up with inflation and it drags more people into higher bands of tax, and it affects lower and middle income people disproportionately.
Also, Kenny's performing name.
What's that?
Fiscal drag.
Fiscal drag. I'm copywriting that. Can you see a time when chancellors are ever going to be able to give up the sort of the crack cocaine that fiscal drag is? Because it is the sneakiest of taxes. And what happened at PMQs today is challenged to repeat what Reeves had pledged. Starmer dodged it, which is a little flag waving, I think.
Yeah, I don't know how much one would read into Starmer dodging it, because I think any sensible prime minister in those circumstances just
a week out of from the
you just don't want to say anything. But having said all that, I think that's what they'll do. So I think they'll add another couple of years to that. It does, at the end of your forecast, it raises you quite a lot of money. I think they will do that. Or it's one of those policies that works really well until it doesn't.
Right.
So at some point or other, people will conclude, actually, you know what, it really is a basic rate now is 40%, because you'll start to have people full-time jobs on, I mean, we're not there yet, but you carry it so far, and eventually you'll have someone on a full-time job on the minimum wage and they're paying the higher rate of income tax. Once that starts happening.
Don't give them ideas. Please don't give them ideas.
We're some way off that, but you see what I mean, where suddenly it becomes, hold on, there's a starter rate and there's a basic rate.
We can see what you're doing now.
Yeah. Naomi, I wanted to ask you, look, we're going to put links in the show notes to both the Resolution Foundation assessment and the IFS assessment, because they are so technical, they are so fiddly. They're basically taking a lot of money from some people and spreading it around many more people, but in a way that declares an intention, I guess. And what I wanted to ask you, because I know you feel very passionately about this, I find it hard to look at the reforms and not see an underlying assumption that there are people who claim health-related benefits who could be incentivized into work by the lack of those benefits, that there is, therefore, an overstatement of health concerns, either by doctors or by the claimants. Is there evidence of this?
No. I believe that the fraud rate, if want a better word,
I'm not quite talking about fraud. There's no fraud on PIP.
Look, for hundreds of years, we have sought to condemn the idle and the feckless for their ills without very much, if any, evidence or efficacy. And what we do know is that any measures that have been put in place to coerce, punish, or humiliate people who are poor, who are sick, prove counterproductive. There's just no evidence that the dramatic rise in mental ill health is anything other than a reflection of a real increase in, for instance, psychological problems that have been predicted by experts that were modelling and analysing the effects of austerity, COVID-19, cost of living. University of Edinburgh did good work, basically saying about 335,000 excess deaths as a consequence of cuts during the 2010 to 2015 period. So they're able to kind of model, well, what would the rate have been, etc. So we know that this kind of stuff really hurts people. And I think that the main issue that I have with all of this is just the fundamental lack of understanding about why people aren't working. And they are multifaceted in their reasons. But if you take, for instance, somebody with a degenerative and chronic condition like multiple sclerosis, you're on a PIP form and you have to answer the question, can you walk 200 meters? Yes or no? If you can, 0 points. If you can't, 2 points. Well, maybe you can. But that will mean that you have to stay in bed for 2 days afterwards. And there is just no scope to understand dynamic disability, to understand that there are trade-offs to everything. And when you are sat there on benefits with a chronic degenerative condition, you have to think about the trade-offs. We don't live to work. We work in order to be able to live. And if you can muster the energy, the lack of pain, whatever, to get through, say, 16 hours of work a week, but the price of that is that somebody else has to do all of your cooking, cleaning, looking after your children, and you're in bed for the entire rest of the time recovering from it. You can't spend the proceeds of that income in any meaningful way. So the incentive is therefore surely not to work, because there is no understanding of the trade-off. It's not just a financial decision.
And I think it's worth making the point that the people who are suffering, when people pass, it's not always a medical condition that claims them. Suicide is the largest killer of young people in this country, and it still remains, I believe, the biggest killer of men under 50. It's a huge health issue, and of course it's a hidden health issue, and the results of the cuts that we're about to see are going to feed right into that. And of course, that's the end point for so many people, at the point where the body and their minds are not working properly, the system's not helping them. That's the full stop at the end, sadly.
I mean, at the other end of the spectrum, I happened to be in the LBC studio today, and the person before me was a woman called Suzanne O'Sullivan, who has written a very interesting book called The Age of Diagnosis. And the point she makes, I think, is that all of these things are on a spectrum. And when you have systems that force you to say either yay or nay, when you have a system that incentivizes you to say, I cannot do any work ever again, because it makes a massive financial difference, then that's the side you're going to try and fall towards. And I think one of the more encouraging reforms being proposed, actually, is this idea of giving it a try, of understanding that people with, health issues might want to try and go back, which is something I saw with my partner up close. We were in a situation where, thank God, his organization had private health cover, because otherwise, his GP was like, come back in 6 months and I'll refer you to a group and whatever. And then he had the rehabilitation treatment through the private provider. And it took a couple of false starts, actually, to get fully back to work.
And so I want to get onto this private insurance thing, because if the social contract is meant to be, while you're healthy and young and able and fit and all the rest of it, that you work and you pay your national insurance as an insurance, should you need it in the future. And then through no fault of your own, you become sick, disabled, whatever. And you are now not going to receive any personal independence payment. Your ESA may be scrapped entirely. The message you are sending the healthy is take out the private insurance because the state are now no longer going to be there for you.
Yeah.
And we already have young people who have very little stake in capital. Capital is not working for them. Capitalism is not working for them because they can never hope to have capital. Odds of getting on the housing ladder if you are a young
Let's
person.
make David defend it.
Saddled with debt. but I genuinely am concerned about how many people are no longer... I do not want us to live in a society where people are turning against the state because it keeps failing them.
Yeah. My question actually is a little more specific. I'm not going to ask you to defend all of it.
I think I'm grateful for that.
But I mean, what happens if every government for decades has come into power hoping for an economic upturn, and external impacts are always held up as exceptional and unprecedented, and they may be exceptional and unprecedented in their nature, but always something comes along. So what happens if circumstances do not improve? What happens if we are looking at a largely stagnant economy in the future that will not grow by the sort of percentages that we've seen in the past? Like, what's the backup plan? I've heard no one say this is how to put the system on a sustainable footing if this is the size of the economy going forward.
I think that's a really good question, if I may say so. And I wrote something a couple of weeks ago for the New Statesman saying how some of the arguments that we're hearing from ministers today are quite similar to the arguments that we were using back in 2010. I'm not sure it was a helpful comment to make from their perspective. But the point I was trying to make is if you are in government, you do have to face up with certain points about, you've got to keep the markets on side, and by which I mean you have to have a sustainable set of public finances. And Liz Truss demonstrated spectacularly from a right-wing perspective of how you can go wrong from that. But the same arguments apply if you make a whole load of spending commitments and can't fund them. The fundamental problem is that whilst we are in a period of low growth, you are always going to be left with these incredibly difficult and unpopular choices. And it might be that the pessimistic view is, well, we are where we are, and this is it. And we've had the global financial crisis, we have had Brexit, we've had COVID, we've had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Yes, a lot of sort of stuff has happened, but is this now an environment where we have to get used to much lower levels of growth? And if that is the case, either we need to sort of very substantially change our expectations of what can be delivered and our living standards, et cetera, or we try to find something that we can do to fix this,
or
and get the economy
our expectations
growing.
about the level of tax.
Yeah, I mean, I'm taking that in the round. Yeah, so I'm taking it either. We have to look at our kind of living standards and public services in the round. And yes, you're right. There are still arguments about the balance between tax and spend. I completely accept that. But it would seem to me what we have to do is question, well, why are we not getting that growth? What are the impediments to that? Some of which are very much political. And be prepared to challenge things.
Can I just ask, is it the case, though, that the global economic system that we've all grown up with has reset completely in such a way that us in the West in particular are going to have to just suck up the fact that the best times economically may well be behind us, and the reality is that we've got a lot of belt tightening to do for the rest of our lives?
Well, the concern has to be, if you're just looking in the immediate, is I've named what the four shocks. There's a fifth potentially in terms of what Trump is going to do and to the world economic system that will be very bad news. I still think politicians have got to go out there and make the argument for the pro-growth approaches, but these are not easy ones. So it's not as if there's a kind of, I don't think there's it's a lack of demand. If only we had a kind of Keynesian stimulus, which suddenly
we're not talking about small levers anymore.
It's about opening up markets. It's about getting your regulatory system right. It is about an efficient tax system. It is about spending money, the money that you do spend it in the way that is as growth supportive as possible. There's lots of things, within that. And I don't think that successive governments have done their best on that. Let's put it that way.
Quiet Riot. Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Quiet Riot. But what I want to talk about is Europe. We can't not talk about Europe and the UK's relationship with Europe. Yeah. We're not very far away now, matter of weeks away from the big summit between von der Leyen and Starmer. And surely, David, the Labour government can use the geopolitical situation within which we find ourselves to say some of those red lines have got to be pink. We've got Germany signing off huge stimulus package as a consequence of the threat from Putin, the US pulling out military spending in our continent. Why are we still seeing a Labour government digging in on its red lines when the growth on offer from a vastly improved trade deal with Europe, if not rejoining the single market? I mean, Starmer himself saying, I'd quite like to be in the single market for defence, as reported in The Telegraph this week. What's holding them back?
That's the thin end.
I agree with you. I think they should. I think, I mentioned a moment or so ago how governments have got to be brave on growth. And this is the obvious lever to pull. I suspect they will move in this direction, but I wish they were moving more quickly in this direction. And I do think the sort of geopolitical point is very valid and very true. Back in 2016, my concerns about leaving the EU were fundamentally about the economics, but the geopolitical argument has moved very, very rapidly.
That's true.
Look, so far, Donald Trump's presidency has been at the kind of worst end of expectations. Not that expectations were very high, but I think it's definitely
it's still managed to limbo under them somehow.
Yeah, it's bad. And if it carries on like this, and you look at some of the ideas that are floating around him, you look at this new chair of his economic advisory board, Stephen Myron, who's got a whole set of policies whereby you extract more pain on your allies and make life more and more difficult. I think the inevitable consequence, if that is pursued, is that you will have a growing divergence between Europe and the US, and the UK is kind of stuck in no man's land. And we know that the closer you are to the US under Trump, the more vulnerable you are to him, the more leverage he has got. And the one thing that Trump does with leverage is use it. So I worry that we are in a very exposed position, and that's going to become clearer and clearer over the next 2 years. And all this sort of talk, well, we might be able to get a deal on steel, or we might be able to get a trade deal. Canada had a really good trade deal with Donald Trump. And he's just ripped it up because if it doesn't suit him, if he thinks there's something, there's an advantage to him, an advantage as a secondary issue to the US as he sees it, then he'll pursue that advantage. So I don't see there's any great upside in a deal with the US, because that's all that is more leverage for Donald Trump to subsequently exploit.
And so to round this off, I just wanted to ask you for your reaction to Kemi Badenoch's latest policy announcement, well, really her first major policy announcement about net zero. Let's have a little listen.
Making promises and not delivering is exactly the reason that the political class has lost trust. The only way that we can regain it is to tell the unvarnished truth. Net zero by 2050 is impossible. I don't say that with pleasure. I want a better future and a better environment for our children, but we have to get real.
What does that even mean? And I mean, why is that consensus collapsing? It's the one thing that we haven't had to argue with each other from different political factions for the last couple of decades. Why is that being reopened as a battlefield?
Actually, I do think this, in a way, comes back to our earlier conversation about growth. Now, I think the argument that Badenoch would make is that, look, getting to net zero comes at a cost. And I think she's legitimate in making that point. What she will say is why the Conservatives will be different from Labour, why they will offer an alternative, is that they will say, we're not going to bear that cost. And under Labour, you will. And where their thinking is by the time we get to the next general election, energy prices will be higher. Doesn't look as if the kind of move towards net zero is bringing the economic benefits that some people argue that it will. And she'll say, this is an economic price and it's too much. And I think she's trying to think as to where the electorate is going to be. Now, that may be very uncomfortable to a lot of people. Her political gamble is to say, by the time we get to 2028, 2029, the high energy costs and the consequence of high energy costs, which she'll say is a result of us going for net zero, the kind of Miliband agenda, she will see that as a vulnerability. And where I have a concern, if you like, about the debate on net zero is that, in my view, too often it's presented as all win-win. And going for net zero will create lots of jobs and it's all going to bring lower prices and so on. Well, I don't think we're going to see that. I think this is a cost that has to be borne to meet an important policy objective, but it's still a cost.
I mean, both things can be true. It can be both a cost and an opportunity, especially if you manage to lead in certain technologies and sink money into the right kinds of research.
In certain sectors, it's a massive opportunity. There's no denying that. But if you take the economy as a whole, and again, this is I'm not wanting to be a Kemi Badenoch spokesman here, but to explain where her sort of politics are coming from is I think she's thinking this, in a few years' time, and also let's also be clear, that's where reform are going to be as well. So she doesn't want to be outflanked there. So that I think is where the thinking comes. I think that still leaves a hole, which is, how are we going to address climate change?
And the bigger hole for me in terms of conservative thinking, just thinking about it from that point of view is, how are you going to have a smaller, less muscular, less intrusive state if you have widespread floods every year, if you have fires every summer?
How are you going to control immigration when you've got mass displacement of people?
There's a cost to all of that as well, which never seems to somehow make the other side of the ledger, I guess. Call to action. Why don't you give us half and I'll give us the other half?
Sure. Well, as ever, we encourage people to write to your elected representatives, write to your local paper, sign any relevant petitions. But I think you've got another one, don't you?
Well, I mean, also, I don't want to say more importantly, actually, because making yourself a nuisance is really worth it. When you're at David will confirm, when you're at the early stages of thinking of a plan, actually, loads of people taking badly to an aspect of it that can really change the government's thinking. But also aspects of the Green Paper have now started opening for proper consultation. So the first one is Pathways to Work, and we will drop the relevant link in the notes. They are inviting replies from everyone that's interested, anyone with skin in the game, not just charities, but individual people with disabilities explaining their experience, what they found has helped and what hasn't. So I think
even if it won't affect you, but you have somebody in your life who it might affect, help them.
Yeah.
Because sometimes just, navigating these things can feel like such an emotional drain if it is very personal to you, or an energy drain if you do not have much energy because of the condition you suffer from. So help other people.
And the reverse is also true. I think that writing that letter makes you feel like you have agency and control of your life, and has a hugely positive psychological effect.
Quiet Riot. Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Quiet Riot.
Once again, it is time for everybody's favourite regular segment. It is, of course, time for Wokey Dokey.
Wokey Dokey.
What's been keeping you wide awake this week, Alex?
Nadine Dorries.
We've not mentioned that name for a while.
Tissa, you're not.
Is she woke now?
No. Okay, so she's written a piece which caused me some very confusing feelings. Ooh. Not since first seeing Patrick Duffy in shorts have I been so confused. Not only because I agreed with almost every word she said, but I actually cheered. Because it's all about Rupert Lowe, and she really does rip him a new one.
Oh, really?
And some of the stories are quite extraordinary about the way he's behaved to parliamentary colleagues.
Where has she written this? Is it
in the Mail.
So it's not a new book? Okay.
No.
Yes.
The reason I say I agreed with almost every word is because the piece also contains the following passage. I was born with the ability to sniff out narcissism, a skill then sharpened by 25 years in the Palace of Westminster, which, just coming from Boris Johnson's #1 fan, that is quite the claim. But I digress. The point is that the continuing saga has elicited a fresh set of responses from the various sides. So donors have expressed dismay about what's going on in reform. And one of them has been Charlie Mullins.
Is he Pimlico Plumber?
Yeah,
yes.
Formerly of Pimlico Plumbers, who said, I want to bang their heads together and get things sorted. The party has gone woke by reporting low to the police.
Okay.
So there you have it. This week, Reform UK is woke.
Whatever next. So, sorry, just help me clear it up. So, Dorries was...
I don't think I'll be able to,
Dorries was reporting on Mullins calling...
No, Dorries was reporting on the general fracas.
Right, okay.
And loads of intel she's had from former parliamentary colleagues, because apparently Lowe is quite badly behaved frequently and to quite a lot of people. And also there are reports on the other side from Politico that he was being flirted by the Conservative Party. He was being courted by the Conservative Party to come across quite heavily before the allegations came out and he was referred to the police. They saw him as someone they might be able to pinch from reform and as a really good new MP. So...
And whose side is Mullins on? Is he Team Lowe or Team Farage? Or
Team Lowe, I think. If he's suggesting that anything left of Lowe is now woke, including Nigel Farage, I think. I mean,
incredible.
It's incredible, isn't it? The goalposts keep moving every week. So
thank you, Alex.
You're welcome.
We'll drop a link in the show notes.
Quiet Riot.
One of the Labour government's first moves was to tackle prison overpopulation. both the UK's prison and justice systems are in crisis. The courts are backlogged, probation services overrun, and prisons both crumbling and fit to burst. These are all problems the new Labour government has promised to fix. Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood has unveiled a sweeping prison and justice reform package, pledging to tackle overcrowding, rethink sentencing, and invest in rehabilitation. Critics from the right argue that Labour's approach risks being too soft on crime. And alternatively, critics on the left say it's not radical enough to fix deep-rooted issues.
In one of the more creative policy ideas, he's full of them. Lee Anderson wants to solve Britain's worker shortage by using banged-up convicts. Britain's 90,000 prisoners could be let out, well, for a bit, presumably in chains, so they can pick fruit and veg.
Yeah, there is a problem with in the agricultural sector with seasonal workers. I did have a solution, but I was sort of shouted down when I first got to this place. We've got 90,000 people languishing in jails in this country, and about 90,000 people short of picking fruit and picking vegetables. I think that there's a good start. So if we've got a labour shortage, we need to look inwards.
Well, former Prisons Minister Anne Widdecombe, Britain is facing a worker crisis. Should prisoners be allowed out to roam the countryside and pick strawberries?
Well, I don't entirely dismiss the proposition, but you've got to be mighty careful. No, you can't let 90,000 prisoners out to do that. What you can't do is just take convicts out willy-nilly. You can't do that.
David, I'm going to ask you a very short question. What is prison for?
It's a good question, and there are a number of objectives that's set out in legislation. My view is that one has rather become dominant, which is punishment. And I do think punishment is a legitimate part of the justice system, and prison plays a role here. But there are other aspects as well, including rehabilitation. And fundamentally, I think we do have to ask ourselves the question is, what is the best way of reducing crime? And I think prison absolutely does play an important part of that. There is a deterrent effect. There is an incapacitation effect. But we, for the last 30 years or so, have had a tendency to, well, we've had a bit of a bidding war between the political parties to say, you know, I'm tough on crime. I'm going to increase this sentence length. I'm going to introduce a new offence, which is imprisonable, whatever it might be. And all of that has essentially built up and come to a state of crisis now, where even though our prison capacity is much greater than it once was, it is full. It's full again, even today, even after exceptional action was taken in the spring. There's a new prison coming online in the next few weeks that will ease pressure a little bit. But, essentially we have got a very high prison population by historic standards, by European standards, and we don't have a particularly low reoffending rate.
No, what is it? That's what it, so if one of the elements of prison objectives is rehabilitation, I think I read somewhere like almost 50% of inmates will reoffend within the first 12 months.
Yeah, it depends on which cohort you're looking at. So those with sort of shorter sentences tend to reoffend more often, more quickly, to some extent, because those who are in for a shorter period tend to be more prolific minor offenders, whereas very serious offenders, don't tend to commit another really serious offence at the same rate, thankfully. But yeah, look, our reoffending rate has sort of overall has moved around from sort of 20 to 30% or so. But you can go to other countries where it's noticeably lower than that. Yeah. And one of the problems is that our very big prison population and overcrowded prisons means that, one, you don't have scope within prisons to do as much rehabilitation as you would like to do. And two, the prisons and prison building and supporting people in prison consumes an awful lot of resources that can then not be deployed in other parts of the system that might be more effective. And so, over years we've seen more in prisons and less in probation.
Well, indeed. And the hackneyed phrase, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Are we serious as a nation about tackling the causes of crime?
We can definitely do more, and we can debate as to what the causes are. But let's take a lot of there's a lot of concern, understandably, about very prolific offenders who might not be committing the most serious offences, but
they're doing
petty
crime frequently.
Doing petty crime frequently, and it's very aggravating for society, and particularly the victims if you're a shopkeeper, etc., etc. Now, those people, by and large, have mental health issues. They have addiction issues of whether it's drink or drugs. You can put them into prison for a short period of time, but they will then come out largely with the same problems and commit the same offences. And that's where the reoffending rate is really high for those types of people. Now, some of those people, it is really hard to solve. We can't be naive and think everyone is a sort of blank sheet that we can completely write something new upon, but there are programs, there is treatment that can make a difference for quite a lot of these people, and I think we do need to think about how we can more intelligently do that, more effectively do that. And as part of the sentencing review, we're looking at evidence of things that we already do in this country that work quite well. We looked at what's working in other countries as well. So we'll come forward with some recommendations on this so that we can put our prison population on a sustainable footing.
But one of the things that you're hinting at there is that what we discussed in the first part of the programme, the big budget cuts that are coming through the support system, is going to impact on what we're talking about in the second part of this of the programme. In other words, one of the big causes of crime is people who quite simply don't have enough. And if the government is taking a position where it will be driving some people who are already in the margins over the line, do you, having been inside the system, think that there's a real risk that will directly have a measurable impact on the number of people coming into the justice system?
I'm not sure I would say that. What I would say is that there are parts of the system, some of which are explicitly within the justice system, some of which are other parts of the state, that are important in terms of addressing some of those mental health issues, addressing drink and drug addiction. And we need to be very focused on doing what works in those areas. I don't want to sort of give make the case for there's a free pass for people who don't have enough resources to commit crimes. There's lots of poor people who don't commit crimes, and we can kind of go back to in the 1950s. By current standards, almost everybody lived impoverished lives, and crime was incredibly low. But nonetheless, there are sort of specific things that we can do that I think would be more effective in reducing crime than necessarily just always building more prisons and expanding what happens in the prison system.
One of the points I was hinting at was the fact that we still think very much in siloed terms, don't we? If you're a minister running a department, your focus is very much on that department, and the interdepartmental competition hasn't stopped.
It's a really good point. So I obviously was Justice Secretary, and I was conscious in my time there that many of the levers that I would have liked to have pulled to reduce pressure on the prison system were outside my department.
Home Office.
So health, housing, education, DWP. There were different things that I would love to be able to do. By and large, I would find my ministerial colleagues really supportive, actually. But then, how do you translate that through the system? And if you're an official in the Department of Health or NHS England, as was, then that might not be your priority. That might not be the thing that you're going to be measured on in terms of your career success and so on. So that sort of silo issue is a challenge. There's no doubt about it.
And can you talk us through some of the alternatives to prison that you mentioned that other countries do, that we do some of here? Because I'm trying to gauge the political bandwidth, I think, particularly a Labour government has for being seen to be offering a softer option than sort of hard jail time.
Well, there are other options within the system that we have here, which are used, but maybe could be used more. there's always, of course, many offenders will have community sentences, but we need to make sure that those work, that they're properly respected, that they are effective. And this again comes back to ensuring that the probation system is working properly. We increasingly make use of home detention curfew. Other countries do the same, but essentially
with tagging and things
with
like
tagging, and so people are essentially based in their home. They may be allowed out for certain hours, what have you. New technology is going to make that increasingly easy to do and effective to do. We can. We will be capable of monitoring people very closely, even if they're not within prisons.
Electronic curfews, are those? Yeah. Like, as in limiting people's access to the internet on their smartphone and
absolutely. We can,
after a particular time. And because that seems to me quite an effective deterrent, especially for someone young.
And there are things like Gamban, which is a great app for people who have gambling problems that they can download, and it will, across all of their devices, just not allow them to gamble or access gambling sites and things like that, which, again, can be a very powerful and useful thing for some people.
Yeah, we absolutely can think imaginatively about that and creatively, and we'll come forward with our recommendations. I don't want to
we're not asking for a scoop. Don't you worry.
Exclusively reveal that we're going to come up with some ideas. But yes, you're right to raise that sort of idea.
What do you think of the two-tier stuff?
Levelled at Keir Starmer, you mean?
Yeah, well, Keir Starmer, but also the justice system.
Because it rhymes with Keir.
Yeah, but also the justice system in general, like the most recent stuff about the sentencing recommendations that there should be reports for particular cohorts was not directly levelled at Starmer. In fact, his government has kind of gone, but it's had cut-throughs, which says to me, always in politics, when something has cut through, it's working with a pre-existing impression that's out there in the public eye. Why do you think that is? Do you think it is legitimate? Do you think there is a sort of two-tier?
I don't think that we have a two-tier system. I can see why there were concerns about the substance within that guidance. So I do, I've not particularly spoken publicly about this, but I do think it was unfortunately worded, and the suggestion that essentially pre-sentence reports, which is what we're talking about here, should be rationed on the basis of race, I think is one that, creates an open goal to someone who wants to make those arguments, that the system is two-tier and what have you. And I think the broad principle that everyone has to be treated equally under the law is a really important one. And I think we have to bear that in mind. But I think that also, it is an example of one of the issues that we face in our politics at the moment, that it is quite fractured. And, you can have identity politics of various kinds, and there are people on the populist right who will want to exploit that. I think I'm not a big fan of identity politics, whether it comes from the left or the right. And I think it is a salient reminder that we have to be conscious of that. And I'm not altogether surprised that there is a strong political consensus, Labour and Conservative, on this. Very, very wary about bringing identity politics into our justice system.
I think the last thing I wanted to ask, just because every time I read about it, it seems incomprehensible. Indeterminate sentences. Although they were abolished in 2012, the legislation was not retroactive. So there's still thousands of people who are subject to them. 90 such people have died by suicide. Is there a practical difficulty with fixing this? It just seems everyone agrees that this is not a situation that should be there, and yet there it is 13 years later.
Yeah, it's not within the scope of the independent sentencing review. Let me be very candid with you as to why it is such a difficult one, because part of the problem why there are still so many inside is some that get released and then go back in again. They're recalled, and it's definitely been a terrible policy. But part of the difficulty here is that those who were sentenced to an IPP sentence are very often, whether that's because of who they were at the beginning of the process or who they are now, there are concerns about whether they are going to be a risk when they are released. And look, I think the government has got some measures, and the previous government, Alex Chalk, I think deserves some credit for a way in which we can try to reduce that IPP population. But the concern that is within the system is, if you just open the doors and let all of those people out,
if one goes on to
one
do
goes on, and these
horrific.
are very often people who are failing their parole hearings. That the parole board thinks they're a continued threat to society. And yes, if you have one horrible case, and I always worried as Justice Secretary, that if my focus was trying to liberalise the system, that if I went too far in that area, that what would happen is an iconic case, and then a whole agenda would be lost. Now that's not an easy message for the IPP prisoners to hear or their families to hear, and I certainly wish we weren't in there. But to answer frankly your question, that is the concern that hangs over successive administrations.
It's messy. It's very messy, and some people who shouldn't be swept with it are basically.
Yeah, and that process of going in and not knowing when you're going to be released, and then there for year after year after year, must have a pretty devastating impact.
And David, a call to action for our listeners, those that are keen on prison reform, justice, what might they be able to do? Is there any cause they can get behind?
There are a lot of great charities that are out there that support rehabilitation. There's organisations. I've stepped back from the Prison Reform Trust whilst doing this review, but I'm a trustee of that. So
go and check them out. We'll leave a link in the show notes.
Check them out. But there are lots of charities who do really good work in terms of rehabilitation. There are lots of, I'm sure lots of your listeners are also employers, and a willingness to take on ex-offenders, and
the Timpson effect.
The Timpson effect, and there are many others I could mention who do really good work, and very often come out, far more often than not, come out of that experience going, actually, what you've got is somebody who is really loyal, appreciates the opportunity, and will pay back and become
work extra hard,
really value the job that they have, and so make excellent employees. And when you do meet ex-offenders who have, turned their lives around, faced up to what they have done, and decided that they really want to make a success of something, it's an incredibly uplifting experience. I've been lucky enough to have that on a number of occasions. Doesn't happen with everybody, but my word, there are a lot of people who
deserve a second chance
and take that second chance when they get it.
Lovely. Well, listeners, we'll leave a link to as many of those as we can find in the show notes.
Quiet Riot.
It's now time for the final little section. Some good news. So let's have a little grin and share it.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. I want good news.
What have you got for us, Naomi?
Well, sign language has gone green.
What?
So words like sustainability, climate crisis, deforestation are obviously very common parlance for all of us, and if you're not deaf. But until recently, they had no British Sign Language representation. So people had to resort to finger spelling out these quite long words like
sustainability and deforestation. That's quite a lot of...
But now a total of 400 signs related to environmental science have now been developed using scientists, educators and signing linguists. This is part of a project from University of Edinburgh's Scottish Sensory Centre in an effort to make the topic much more accessible for the deaf community and particularly children. So previously, if a deaf teacher wanted to use the term greenhouse gases, they would painstakingly GREEN, it's a long old one to spell out. And the new sign kind of takes a conceptual approach. So it visually represents the word. So greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane interacting with the sunlight in the Earth's atmosphere. So both hands begin to do circular shapes.
So they show the swirling
exactly.
around the...
Gestures to show the presence of gases in the atmosphere. And then the left hand changes to a flat position to represent the Earth's surface. And the right hand changes to an extended finger that moves downward and bounces back up towards the left hand, kind of neatly demonstrating how sunlight reflects from the Earth's surface, gets trapped by greenhouse gases, can't get back out. So I just think this is wonderful and lovely and a really great good news story. And,
Agreed.
As people who do a very audio-focused show, we do always have a transcript in the show notes so that our deaf followers can keep up with what we're talking about. I just thought this was a very, very lovely, overdue glossary for the deaf. In the last 12 months, the site has had nearly 370,000 people visiting it to learn about the signs. Interpreters have been getting up to speed with it all, using it in Parliament, on television, school classrooms, etc., as well as in higher and further education. So we will leave a link in the show notes to that good news story.
Absolutely
what a happy
splendid.
Story.
Yeah, I like that. And it's in keeping with our topic one.
Indeed. And that is the end of this week's show. Our enormous thank you to David Gauke for joining us.
Pleasure.
Remember, our business model is as different as our approach to podcasting. All of our content is free to everyone, everywhere, forevermore. We rely on the generosity of those of you who can afford to support us and value what we do. And you can do so on ko-fi.com/quietriotpod.
And of course, we're going to be back on Sunday with Sunday School. But next week, there is, of course, the spring statement, the budget, whatever you want to call it. And so we've got our favourite friendly economist, Vicky Price, back on the show to give us all of the detail.
And we will have more details about the precise welfare cuts.
Indeed. So do stay tuned for that one. Make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode and you catch those as soon as they drop.
Keep fighting. We love you lots. Bye.
Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Well done in dealing with that horrible noise.
It's all right.
I
was 14 years in the House of Commons. So, yeah.